So I've been asked just to talk about some things relating to fashion, some insights that our work relating to garments, to types of dressing, to the ways that people put garments on their bodies and the huge supply chain associated with that, impacts on sustainability and the sorts of things that we're doing to transform that in lots of different ways. Before I begin, is anyone here a designer or from a design background? We have a nice little club. They're all on the same table. Okay, so I'll just give a bit of an introduction so perhaps you can understand. I know there's lots of different disciplines here, so you can understand what the discipline of design makes of sustainability. How does it sort of sit with sustainability ideas? In the 1990s, and well before that, in fact, 30, 40 years before that, designers were increasingly aware of the impacts of what they do on the environment around them and on culture more broadly. And the relationship between design and culture is very well known within the design professions. But perhaps for the first time, people were actively taking responsibility for the sorts of things that they were creating, the sorts of products they were creating, and also the sorts of consumptive behaviours that are linked to the products that they're creating. So an architect in the 1990s said, in many ways the environmental crisis is actually a design crisis. It's a consequence of the way that things are made, constructed, used, and actually you begin then to feel the sense of responsibility that design since then has really beginning to embrace. And this figure is bandied around a lot, and I know that it came from the electronic products sector, some guys that were looking at the impact of telephones and trying to measure how much influence a designer has on the future environmental impact of a product, came up with the figure that between 80 and 90% of a product's environmental impact is decided in design. Well before production begins, it is that the impact begins then. So if you can get the design right, potentially you can remove between 80 and 90% impact, like a factor 10 reduction. I mean, it's huge potential in theory anyway. And why is that so powerful? Well, mainly because design actions can be preventative. You can build environmental foresight into a product, into a set of interactions, into a service. And so this then has spawned a whole manner of activities, approaches, strategies, practices that are influencing business, and you can see them right through fashion and through lots of other product sectors too. And also, more latterly, we're beginning to look at the social world much more and begin to think about the relationship between, in my case, fashion and people much more. And there was a quote also from the 1990s which said, design is the most proactive direct action you can take to achieve impact prevention. I mean, everybody loves a bit of direct action, no more than me, but when you begin to think about this potential to create things differently, it's substantial. But it's not just those who are trained professionally as designers that this is about. To be quite frank, it's all of us. Because everybody, all the academics that are here, certainly I would put in this camp, and certainly all the business owners, probably more so the business owners and the small business representatives, because everybody who is trying to change a course of action from one thing to a preferred thing is actually engaging in design practice. So it's actually the responsibility sits with all of us. Anyway, without further ado, I'll talk about essentially, this is in sort of crude terms, the two main ways that designers engaged with sustainability ideas and what insights we can offer from that. And the first, quite simply, is that people have been approaching design as a problem minimizing strategy, pursuing efficiencies, trying to increase the efficiency of the supply chain, for example, substituting materials, a whole raft of things associated with that. And the second approach, and often these happen sometimes at the same time, but often they're mutually exclusive in people's minds, but not necessarily, is that it's not about minimizing the problems, but it's about creating the sorts of behaviors and opportunities that we want to see. So there's a bit of a division here. And there's loads of differences between them. I've got a whole list, but I won't go into that in detail. But essentially, these things are happening at different scales of activity. One is looking at generally short-term, small-scale, quite technologically driven change. The other is looking at much longer-term, perhaps radical socio-cultural shifts. And what you see is the scales of activity are very, very varied between these two sort of general approaches. And one, the latter, is seen as more radical, more looking towards the big sorts of cultural and systems change that people think is necessary for sustainability. And the former is perhaps about incremental change, about using managerial ingenuity differently, about engaging with these systems in from where we are now. Perhaps you could call it the art of the possible. So, so the first one, I'm just going to this is a whistle-stop tour through a very few of the ideas. So some of the problem minimizing approaches, looking through the supply chain, loads of material substitution work goes on, as people are looking to soy, to corn, to recycled materials, to organic alternatives, to eucalyptus trees to substitute within fibre production processes, hemp, my personal favourite, flax. Innovative manufacturing models as companies as varied as Marks and Spencer at one end and then small companies at the other are trying to do things differently. Maybe they're using solar energy or just human-powered machines to make things differently. We have different approaches to waste reduction, trying to reduce it by laying out a pattern differently. In this case, using all of the materials, selvage to selvage. At the moment, for those of you who don't know, when you lay out a garment, when you're about to cut out the pattern pieces that you then sew to make up a garment, you lay them out on a big piece of fabric and then there's about 10 to 15% waste, cut loss it's called, around that. So people are tessellating these shapes differently to try to reduce waste. Marks and Spencer, you probably know, I've seen them on the streets. They've redesigned their trucks to be more energy efficient. This goes right through distribution, supply chains, as people are beginning to try to figure out ways to do that. Companies are reaching into homes and trying to reduce the impact of the laundering process, which for commonly laundered clothes like t-shirts and underwear is about 80% of the environmental impact of garments across the life cycle. It's a big deal. And people are doing that by trying to get people to turn the temperature of the machine down. How effective it is another question. Optimizing end of life. So companies are looking at what they can do around the end of the life of a product. This is an image from the Philippa K store in Sweden, in Stockholm. And this is entirely made up of second-hand Philippa K clothes. Philippa K buys back second-hand clothes from its customers once they've finished wearing them and resells them, but it's a charity shop which is only stocked with Philippa K garments. And this is next to their store selling new pieces. And then people are, perhaps you've seen products like this, making new garments out of old fabric and often using different techniques to find ways to minimize the amount of waste associated with it. And it's really good work. There's lots of stuff going on. It's fabulous. And I would say that in the main, over the last 20 years, we have, in the fashion sector, reduced the environmental burden of producing garments. And it has led to efficiency improvements. But the big problem is that, unfortunately, is not enough, because in that same period, the amount that we're consuming has increased at a far faster rate. And so actually we have no net improvement in the sector. In fact, actually, things are getting worse. So this has been known for quite a long time, and the ways that people are beginning to think about this is to try to reimagine what fashion can be in different sorts of configurations. How can we look at opportunities for fashion which don't just sit within the narrow frame of the market? What other opportunities are there? So we have embraced lots of other practices, lots of other vocabulary and ways of knowing, and this has led us to loads of different routes. There are projects galore on adaptability. This is a piece that ships in different ways. There's loads of work around local fibres, around speed. I've done a lot of work around slow culture and fashion in particular. Lots of work around services, shifting towards a less product or material intensive opportunities around the fashion space, some more successful than others. And in this whole journey, this journey that we started on even just like 10 minutes ago, from looking perhaps at different materials, organic cotton, different sorts of material substitutes, we've reached a point in our potted history of what insights we have from the fashion sector about sustainability. We've reached a point where, because of issues to do with the relationship between fashion and consumer culture, because of all of these profound challenges with resource scarcity, climate change, and their incompatibility with our current ways of buying stuff, we've reached a point where we realise that we need to have a different point of departure, a shift away from thinking about things and actually much more to thinking about people. Let's not forget, perhaps a little dissimilar to food, I'm sure there's lots of people who are going to talk about food today, that clothing has a deeply social nature. There's lots of social aspects to food, I know, but I think it is a little different to clothing. And this is where I suggest that we need to begin really to begin to push towards sustainability agendas more fully. What we realise is that in all of the efforts that have gone on, all of the things that I've shown you, which are really important, but we fail to realise that garments are influenced by what happens beyond design and production, by the stuff that happens when a person gets home, unpacks their bag at their kitchen table, or goes upstairs and opens their wardrobe door and looks at. We've failed to recognise that this is really important, and that actually sustainability really is based in what happens in those sorts of interactions, the sorts of ideas, the values, the habits, the practices, the lives that go on in this space. This is the place where it happens. So I've been doing a lot of work, so it's now finished, but I gathered over 500 interviews from the public about the things that they do as they're using their clothes. And so these skills and practices and the things that go on when people get stuff home, I would say are the skills of usership. It's very, very difficult to get people to talk about how they use their clothes. People are like, well, what do you mean? If you ask people how they go about shopping for clothes, they could talk to you forever. But the skills of usership are not things that we currently value or focus on. And so this body of work, all of this stuff that goes on when after the point of sale, this whole world begins to be a world that I think design and business really begins to need to work with. And I call it the craft of use. This woman, for example, so of all of the stories from the public that I gathered, this woman is Jean. She's in her 80s. She was given this dress when she was about 30, and she was going to the south of France on a holiday. And her neighbour gifted it to her. She said, because you're going to the south of France, this is the sort of thing that you need to wear as you're in Antibes, hanging around there. And so she wore it, she said, and it was a real success, and she was delighted with it. And now this same dress is worn by her 3 daughters and 2 granddaughters. And they compete to wear it because they actively all want to be in this piece that for her family has had this huge story and significance, but also is a piece that for them tells the story of what it is, the significance of being in that family and all of those values. So what we see is there's opportunities for people to organise things differently. I suppose what I realise, and I think is really important, is that we have to realise that things need to be tended and cared for, no less created. And everybody within the fashion space, and certainly me in my past, I have put all of the effort into making new stuff. But the realisation actually is what we have to do is begin to figure out what we do with the stuff we've already got and find opportunity in that space instead. And for that, it requires us to do something which is extremely challenging, and particularly for business, is to try to figure out what sorts of things, the spectrum of activity that we can find valuable that doesn't just sit within the traditional market. In formal economies, in all of these other spaces, there's loads of good stuff going on. And we can make money out of it, but we need to find ways to do that with different sorts of resource implications, but perhaps more importantly, with implications that do us well in the core of our species, that actually make us happier. I'm sure you're all familiar with all of the psychological research, which of course shows that there is no link between more stuff and happiness, and also that a materialistic mindset even undermines us even more. And within fashion, perhaps there is no product area which people have more of a materialistic mindset. So what I would say, and I'm just going to leave you, I think this is almost the end of my slide deck. So these are all the photos just of the public. So essentially what I think is that up until this point we've been very slow to realise that design and use, or the things that go on when you get the thing home, form a single whole. Certainly we've been looking at it in certain ways, trying to control it, but sort of reaching from where we are into that place, but without really holding the hand of the user. And I think this is this new step forward where we begin to embrace sustainability much more holistically. And what we see is that business, academic work, research, all of this will take place in a much broader field where we begin to value opportunities differently. Oh yeah, and there's going to be a book with loads of the stories coming out in the spring. And it looks a bit like Mao's little red book. I didn't... it's not like that inside. Okay, thank you. That's all I'll say.